Tariq, it's a pleasure to talk to you about your book, The Duel. Pakistan is one of those countries that everybody in the United States is talking about, but unlike the weather, everyone thinks they seem to know that something that they can do about it. In fact, really, people don't understand Pakistan. I hope that people do some reading of this latest series of books that have come out, above all yours. As we talk here, they're still, I guess, cleaning up the mess at the disaster site in Islamabad, where the Marriott was bombed. And we now know that almost the entire Pakistani leadership, including the president and the prime minister, were supposed to have had a dinner there the very evening of the bombing that they changed at the last minute, which means that the Pakistani leadership could have been decimated. Leaving aside America's interests in fighting al-Qaeda, from the standpoint of Pakistan's interests, do you think that this is a mortal threat to the Pakistani state, and do you think that they're equipped to be able to deal with it going forward?
Bob, there was another reason for the attack, according to the Pakistani media, which I've been reading quite closely. One is, of course, that the cabinet and the president were going to be eating at that hotel and changed their venue at the last minute. The other reports now surfacing inside Pakistan are that a whole group of Marines arrived with steel boxes which circumvented security, weren't put through the scanners on September the 17th. And that news of this spread rapidly. But who knows whether it was one or the other. The fact is that the escalation inside Pakistan, in my view, is a direct result of the escalation of the war inside the tribal areas of Pakistan, following the decision by the United States to go in whenever they wished and drop bombs, send in predator drones, consider violating that country's sovereignty. All the reports coming in from that region suggest that this has seen a big increase in Pashtun. These are the people who live there, the Pashtuns, in Pashtun nationalism against the foreign presence. A report on the BBC by one of their veteran South Asian correspondents, Owen Bennett-Jones, a few days ago, reported that he had been talking to liberal, secular, beardless Pashtuns in the capital, Peshawar. And he said they were just desperate, saying, you are pushing us away by the way you are behaving in this part of the world, and soon we will have no alternative but to fight against you. Now, when people like this start saying this to the BBC in public, it's a sign of how bad things are. So I think the Marriott is one episode in an escalation that is taking place in that region as a result of the war in Afghanistan going badly wrong. Obviously, these militants, the jihadis, call them what you will, are now threatening the Pakistani leadership because they see this leadership as complicit in what the United States is doing. I don't think that they are anywhere near strong enough to take on the Pakistani military, which is a very large force. But I think they're certainly capable of creating mayhem, as they did at the Marriott.
You say in your book that the threat of a jihadi takeover of Pakistan is remote. And of course, the religious parties, the fundamentalist parties, don't do well in elections and so forth. You also say, though, that if the United States attacks Pakistan, crosses the border, if the United States were to occupy parts of the northwest frontier areas, that this could cause the Pakistani army to split, that there's a great deal of sympathy among the army for the militants, and that in fact, in that event, you say in your book, the possibility of a jihadi takeover would increase, could actually become conceivable. Now, we've seen in the last weeks exactly that. We've seen the United States begin, as they did in Southeast Asia when they blamed Cambodia for being the redoubt for the Viet Cong. They've now expanded the Afghan war directly into Pakistan. So Does that mean that the army in Pakistan could split, that the appeal of the jihadis and the militants and the Taliban could increase to the point where it actually becomes a threat to the Pakistan state?
Well, this is the million-dollar question, as they say, Bob. I mean, I'm very nervous, to be blunt with you. I think that the unity of the Pakistani High Command, of which they're very proud, has never been broken so far. But if there were to be a direct US military presence, I'm not now talking about cross-border bombing raids. These create real anger and bitterness in the region. I'm talking if the US decided to go beyond that in phase 3 of this latest offensive and actually send troops in. That, I think, would really put very severe strains on the Pakistani military leadership. As it is, and this is not a fact much talked about in the West, Pakistan and its army has lost more soldiers in the battle against the jihadis on the northwest frontier than any single NATO country. Pakistani soldiers have died. Some have given themselves up rather than fight. Young Pakistani officers sent for a tour of duty to the northwest frontier. Some of them prefer to take early retirement and move out of the army together. Why? Because they do not like the orders given to them to shoot their own people, regardless of who they are. It's this that creates the tension. If the US were to make a serious move into Pakistan, I think the army would find it very difficult to preserve its unity unless, of course, it decided to resist and fight back, which is what the Pakistani generals are saying, that if there's a direct invasion, they would resist. Whether they would or could is, of course, another question. But the reason they're saying that is to preserve the unity of this armed force inside the country, which, after all, is the only institution with which the US has preserved and maintained friendly relations now over 60 years. So if they're going to lose this institution in Pakistan, the consequences are unpredictable.
Mm-hmm. You know, in Iraq, the site of the other war, besides the Afghan-Pakistan war, it's often said that there's no apparent Nelson Mandela there. There's no apparent unifying figure, no politician who commands national loyalty and respect the way Mandela did in South Africa. But it's clear that that's also true in Pakistan. You call in your book Pakistani politics, you compare to a desert, and you say there's not even an imaginable oasis there. You're very hard on the Pakistani leadership over decades. Is there any possibility in that country of a strong, authentic nationalist leader or leadership developing? Is there anything on the horizon? Or if not, what's the potential for that? Where would that come from?
Well, official politics in Pakistan, the two principal parties, the party of the late Benazir Bhutto, which she bequeathed in her will to her son and her husband till the son came of age. The fact that this could happen in Pakistan is, of course, deeply depressing. That all the dignitaries and functionaries of this party allowed this to happen without raising their voices in protest is a sign of what politics in that country is. The opposition to the PPP comes from the Sharif brothers and their political organization, the Muslim League. Both these parties and the gang of politicians Musharraf relied on in his last 5 years are deeply mired in corruption, Bob. And everyone knows it. They loot the country. They make money from being in power. Power for them is a springboard to loot and accumulate wealth, and they have all done it. So they are pretty discredited with ordinary people, and we are now talking of a time when the price of wheat, from which people poor and middle class make their bread, is so high that it's unobtainable and unavailable and inaccessible to a large swathe of the population. We have a situation in Pakistan where, according to the latest UN development statistics, 60% of children born in that country are being born stunted because of malnutrition. These are the scale of the problems which confront Pakistan's political leadership, and they so far have been incapable, military or political leadership, of dealing with these problems. Now, Nelson Mandela is a far cry in Pakistan, but there is one figure who emerged over the last few years who really won the respect of ordinary people in a way that I haven't seen in Pakistan for a very long time, and that was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This was a guy who gave judgments that favored the poor, who judged without fear or favor. He made himself extremely unpopular with the Pakistani establishment and the Western establishment because he refused to accept that people could be disappeared off the streets. And he was removed and sacked in a very brutal, cold-blooded fashion. He remains one of the most popular figures in the country. And I have written that were there to be a direct election for the presidency, which there isn't, the president is elected indirectly, there is no doubt that Justice Chaudhry would sweep the board. But he is an individual, he is not a man with a political organization behind him, but he is deeply respected. And that lawyers' struggle, a constitutional struggle for the separation of powers between the judiciary and the government, that is what that movement was about, was very popular in Pakistan. In every city, poor people rallied to the cause of the Supreme Court because it was the only body at that time which they felt was defending them. So it was very short-sighted of the West to demand that the judge not be taken back. This was the demand of the US ambassador, accepted by Musharraf and Zardari. And I think it's a tragedy. So it's not that there aren't people, but they are not people who are allowed to function in that society.
You know, in your book, you provide a rich history of Pakistan that I think provides context for people. You go back to the long, sad history of various Pakistani military autocrats who took over and came and went and their experiments with democracy that seem to have been fatally flawed. What is it, though, that accounts for the fact that next door in India you have a thriving democracy? They've had their problems, of course, with assassinations and with terrorism over the years, but still they have what seems to be a semi-well-functioning democracy there. Yet in Pakistan, which after all was united with India until 1947, Pakistan has been unable to really establish the grounding for democracy. Certainly it is not because Pakistan is a Muslim country, although detractors of Muslims would probably say that. But what's your explanation? What is it in the history of the two countries that makes it so hard for democracy to take root there?
Well, the subtitle of my book, Bob, is Pakistan on the Flight Path of American Power. And this has been the case since the early 50s onwards, that ever since Pakistan as a country and its ruling elite really became an asset of the United States, they have done its bidding. And the only institution in that country which the United States saw as functioning and with which they could deal was the Pakistani military. So every time they felt that their interests were being threatened by the possibility of a general election that might produce a government that would take Pakistan out of its security pacts with the US, Iran, and Turkey, which dominated that region in the 50s and 60s, they asked the army to strike. And the army did. And when the army came, the dictator stayed in power for at least 10 years. That's the time span of the rule of each single military dictator. Then, later on, after this dictator was removed through a mass insurrection, more or less, the country split up because the dictator who succeeded him, while permitting an election, refused to accept the result. So and Nixon and Kissinger tilted towards the dictator. So Pakistan split up in 1972. Then you had a brief period of populist experiments where a great deal was promised by Benazir's father, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, but very little was actually delivered on the ground. And Bhutto then became interested in the idea of developing a nuclear bomb because India had a nuclear bomb. And Kissinger said to him, if you don't desist, we will make a horrible example out of you. Bhutto wrote that in his death cell. It's now been confirmed by others who were present. And they made a horrible example out of him. Another military coup, Bhutto arrested on fake charges and hanged. And that period of General Zia-ul-Haq was the most distressing, brutal period in our country's history. And that is also the period when the Russians go into Afghanistan. So Zia becomes an absolutely vital asset for the West to wage the jihad against the Soviet Union, with encouraging jihadi groups, paying for them to be trained, giving them weaponry, and all the monsters that they spawned at that time are still with us. So the real problem with Pakistan, I think, was twofold. One, it had an underdeveloped political class after partition, unlike India, which had a very long tradition of politics against the British Empire. Most of the people who came to power in Pakistan had collaborated with the British during British imperial rule, and now they've slipped easily into collaborating with the United States. So what I always say is that there's always been a big US lobby in Pakistan, a Saudi lobby in Pakistan, a Chinese lobby in Pakistan, but there is no Pakistan lobby within the elite. They govern essentially in the interests of others.
Is there any chance that any of the political parties, especially the PPP, the Pakistan People's Party, could be transformed or reformed, could emerge as an authentic standard bearer for Pakistani national aspirations, or do you think we need to wipe the slate clean and start over again?
Well, it's always difficult to wipe the slate totally clean once political parties have been established. It's like sort of, you know, baseball teams or soccer clubs. They acquire a loyal fan base who follow them through thick and thin. But I think certainly what needs to be done is to break with dynasties, to break with this awful feudal tradition of a political party being run like as a feudal relic, you know. So I think that is, we need a break with uniforms, but we certainly need a break with political dynasties. There's no way Zardari would have been remotely close to power had he not been the widower of the assassinated Benazir Bhutto. That's the only reason that he's in power, and it's an embarrassment because he's not a serious figure. He's essentially a businessman. Interested in making money. He has no idea. And he surrounded himself with cronies who are now posturing around the place, but who enjoy very little respect. I think Pakistan does need a set of proper political parties which actually act on behalf of the people whose votes they seek. None exist there. And of course, if you say this to some of the politicians running Pakistan, they're saying, well, democracy is going bad everywhere, so why should it be special here? And there is, of course, an element of truth in it, but that is not, it shouldn't be, you know, the fact that democracy is going bad anywhere for Pakistanis shouldn't be an excuse not to do anything or to accept a very corrupt system.
You seem to have in the book occasional mixed feelings about the Bhuttos. They are the political dynasty. I guess they've compared themselves to the Kennedys and other American political dynasties. But you suggest that both Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the president who was overthrown in 1977 by General Zia and then hanged 2 years later, and his daughter, Benazir, had potential, had progressive instincts. Talk a little bit first about the father. You knew him, of course, way back in as early as the 1960s, I guess.
Yeah.
What potential did he have? What could he have done as president? And where did he go wrong? Where did he make his Shakespearean fatal mistakes?
I think basically you have to understand with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the founder of this Bhutto dynasty, political dynasty, that he was essentially, his formative years in politics were under a military dictator. He was a member of Ayub's cabinet. He grew up, and a lot of the bad habits he contracted were in that period of being extremely authoritarian in the way in which he dealt with his own colleagues, was a throwback to his past. But where Bhutto was Ayub, the Field Marshal Ayub finally got rid of him. And this coincided with a large mass movement that erupted in Pakistan in '68. Now, there's a lot of talk this year about the 60s all over the West, but the Pakistani 68 is ignored. This was a student uprising against the military, which triggered off a much wider movement in the country, something that didn't happen anywhere else consistently. And for 3 months, from November '68 to March '69, the students and workers and middle-class layers and the urban petty bourgeois layers fought against the military, despite heavy casualties they suffered, and finally won. The dictator was toppled.
And many of these activists went into the PPP.
And many of these activists went into the PPP, Bob, because Bhutto was one of the few politicians who supported the movement, who put himself at the head of it, who became its voice, and who denounced the military with which he had worked in very sharp language. And so, and in the course of this, he developed a simple program, Roti, Kapra aur Mokan, food, clothing, and shelter for all. Very simple, but very powerful. And this became the emblem of the PPP. This is what we are going to give you if we win. And the country was totally polarized. And Bhutto swept the elections in the western part of Pakistan in 1970, defeating the most entrenched, established landlords all over the country. His party won. And the joke used to be that if a dog stood with the PPP label, the dog would be elected to parliament. And so there was enormous expectations. Then the country split up, and Bhutto's role in that was none too good, but nonetheless, after the split, he had the chance to do whatever he wanted. There was no opposition. The army was crushed. It had broken up the country. It stood defeated. The mood in the country was, we need some radical transformation.
So this was really kind of a turning point, right?
Big turning point. And it's very rare for a political leader to be given a chance to look at the political landscape of his or her country and transform it. Bhutto was given that chance, and he failed. And the first thing that he should have done is to do what the Indians did as early as the 1950s, which is push through drastic land reforms, ending the stranglehold of the landed gentry and the landlords over that country's rural life and urban life and politics. That would have been a big leap forward. And secondly, what he should have done is to have built a social infrastructure on the education and health fronts and moved the country forward. Now, these were perfectly achievable targets. It could have been done if the will had been there. But the will simply wasn't there. Instead, he got involved in grandstanding and posturing on the global stage and nuclear weapons and all that, while the country, the people continued to languish.
You say early in your book that you regret in some ways talking ill of the dead when you talk about Benazir Bhutto, who of course, was assassinated only last year. What do you think were her basic failures? What do you think were the flaws that allowed her as well to have possibly taken the country in another direction. You say in conversations with her in the early 90s that she expressed a lot of progressive instincts and concern about the welfare of the underclasses in Pakistan, yet she too seems to have failed. Did she basically make the same mistake as her father, or was it something different?
Well, it was something different in the following sense, that her father had the possibilities of doing whatever he wanted. The country was with him, the degree of mass mobilizations was high, the traditional rulers of that country lay supine on the ground, couldn't resist. He could have done anything. By the time she had come to power through an election, Pakistan had been under an extremely brutal military dictatorship for 10 years plus, General Zia-ul-Haq's dictatorship, which had brutalized the country and which had forced Islamization from above. That is when that process started. Now, when Benazir was elected, she was hemmed in by a president with powers who was a senior bureaucrat in the country who had collaborated with the military in getting her father hanged. He was on one side and the military on the other. She told me very bluntly, I can't do anything. It's impossible to act because they, by that time the country had been completely transformed in the other direction. And my advice to her at that point was, even if you can't do much, you have to do some things, and it doesn't require too much money to create, for instance, a network of training schools for teachers, women teachers, and setting up schools in every single village to educate girls. I said, you just do that and people will remember you forever, forever. And whenever they talk, they'll say, she is the one who gave our daughters education. She, just lifted her hands in despair. And so I said, if you can't do even that, then you have to go on television and tell the people why. This is one way of educating people, telling them why you can't do it. That wasn't done either. And then in her second term of office, her husband, the current president of Pakistan, was totally out of control on the monetary front. I mean, her second period of office saw endemic corruption and the massive accumulation of wealth by the first couple. I mean, these figures were discussed in a Congress, US Congress report in 1999, published, long surveys of their corruption were published in the New York Times. They're all available. So it's not a big secret what they did, and it's that finally brought about her fall, because the president she had appointed herself said, we can't go on like this, and dismissed her government. So this has been a tragedy for the country and, alas, for her.
We're coming to the end of our first segment, but I want to at least follow up on one point that you make in the book. You somewhat ironically say that her, at the end of last year, she was the one end of an arranged marriage in the good old Pakistani tradition between herself and General Musharraf, who were seen by the United States as kind of the odd couple who could stabilize Pakistan. And of course that didn't work, did it? Why didn't it work? What was the central principle or that went wrong in that arranged marriage? And I guess we have to do it fairly quickly. We can come back in the second half.
Well, I think the basic reason why it didn't work is that by this time Musharraf was extremely unpopular. He'd got rid of the judges. He was completely hemmed in. And sending in a laundered Benazir, cleaned of all the charges against her of corruption, to join him created a great deal of cynicism in the country. And as I wrote at the time, arranged marriages can go terribly wrong. Sometimes the husband's family kill the bride and pocket the dowry. And at other times, both parties suffer and collapse. And this is what happened to the State Department's forced arranged marriage in Pakistan. Both parties fell. One was tragically killed, and the other is out of power. So they have to start all over again.
Well, I think we'll take a break now, and then in the second half we'll come back to the future of Pakistan and where the country is going. Well, we've painted a fairly bleak picture of Pakistan, both in terms of its political leadership and its historical subservience to American interests in that part of the world. One of the things, though, that puzzles me, as well as I think a lot of other people, is the Pakistani military in bed with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, or are they not? It's a difficult question, because when you hear the news, you see that the Pakistani army occasionally sends forays up there. As you mentioned, many thousands of Pakistani troops have been killed fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the border areas. On the other hand, you hear that the ISI, the intelligence service of the army, is supporting covertly the Taliban, has certainly in the past seen them as allies, but even today, even after 9/11, see them as a reserve force, as an ally. You hear talk about a good Taliban and a bad Taliban from Pakistani military types, who say there are some who we can work with and others that we can't. Try to explain this in a way that would make Americans understand, as you understand it. What is the relationship like between the Pakistani military and these militants who are apparently sheltering Al-Qaeda leaders and fighting American troops in Afghanistan?
Let's start with what happened after 9/11, when the United States decided they were going to take the government in Afghanistan out and occupy it. There was very little resistance at the time. And the reason there was very little resistance is that the Pakistani military told the Taliban people under its influence not to fight. Mm-hmm. They said, if you fight, you'll be crushed. It's foolish if you do that. Go and take a rest. And if some of you have to come to Pakistan, but don't fight the Americans. And this is by and large what happened. I mean, a faction led by Mullah Omar, who was then the leader of Afghanistan, didn't agree with that and disappeared to the mountains to wait. And they suffered casualties as well during the bombing raids. But the bulk of the Taliban forces didn't fight back at the time. And unlike Iraq, where resistance began almost immediately, in Afghanistan it took some time to build up. And if you look at US intelligence reports, in recent years, they blame the rise of the Taliban on the endemic corruption, the heroin trade, and the smuggling that goes on under the Karzai regime, and with which people close to Karzai are heavily involved. So that is one thing which we have to understand, of why this war has gone badly wrong inside that country. Secondly, Bob, to come down to your question, I think there's probably no doubt that the Pakistani military is close to one faction of the Taliban. How many people are in this faction remains to be seen, but the fact there is talk of good Taliban and bad Taliban inside the Pakistani military is not restricted to them alone. This is also spoken of in British and American circles, and the British have coined a new word, the neo-Taliban, that this is no longer the old Taliban that is operating in Afghanistan, but it's now become an umbrella for a general hostility amongst Pashtuns to the foreign presence. And both Britain and the United States have been talking to them. Pashto-speaking US agents go, they have conversations, they discuss, and what they're discussing is whether a faction of the Taliban can be brought into the government of Hamid Karzai to sustain him and give him a strength which he's lacking. They've refused. They've said we're not opposed on principle to coalitions, but we will not enter a coalition with a guy who's totally dependent on Western support, and we cannot enter any government as long as there are foreign troops on our soil. So they're all being discussed with. The Pakistani military establishment obviously sees this faction and preserving it is something that is in their own state interests. So they carry on doing it. And I think often the mistake is made of saying that the ISI is somehow different from the Pakistani military high command. There may be odd ISI operatives on the actual border with Afghanistan who sometimes take unilateral decisions. That is possible. It happens wherever countries are engaged in conflict. But by and large, the ISI, large though it is under the control of the Pakistani High Command. The current leader of the Pakistan Army, General Kiani, before that, he was head of the ISI. So they have total control over it, and I think it sometimes becomes convenient from both sides to blame the ISI. It's not that. It is the Pakistani military acting in what it sees are the interests, or its own interests and the interests of the country which it is meant to defend. That's what's essentially going on. So there's no surprise to me that they have links with the Taliban.
Well, earlier this year, we had the remarkable event of the president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, and the United States both saying that they had incontrovertible evidence that the bombing of the Indian embassy in Kabul was carried out by terrorists who were supported, organized by the ISI. They said point blank that this was a Pakistani operation of terrorism inside the Afghan capital. What's your evaluation of that? If the ISI is under the command of the Chief of Staff, did it go that high? Was this rogue operators within ISI, or did they make this up?
My information is that the bombing of the Indian embassy did involve an ISI presence, but that this was a rogue element, or not necessarily even a rogue element, a guy isolated in the frontier posts on the Afghan border who has to deal with local militants because otherwise he wouldn't survive, and that he authorized this particular action. I'm also told that this is something which the Pakistanis initially denied, but now privately have accepted and apologized for to the United States behind the scenes, which is why the issue is not raised. But certainly things like that can happen. I mean, you know as well as I that when a country is occupied, you have rogue elements on both sides, you know, who are out of control and who do things without consulting their superiors. And I think this was one such incident, and it was a appalling thing to do because it, you know, both India and Pakistan are nuclear powers, and anything that exacerbates tensions between these two states is just criminal, in my opinion.
So this, and of course, Karzai went to the inauguration of President Zardari when I guess he was the only foreigner present. So I guess he's trying to mend fences and build relationships there.
I think the invitation to Karzai to attend the inauguration was a clear attempt by Zardari to say to the US political establishment, I can be yours as well. You've got Karzai. I'm just like him. We're both the twins who'll fight the war against terror for you as long as you keep on backing me. I think that was a very clear message being sent to people in the United States who had helped Zardari into power, which certainly wasn't, as we now know, the State Department, but it was Cheney's office in Khalizad who helped to propel Zardari into power by giving him advice, by organizing the fall of Musharraf. And this was Zardari saying thank you very publicly. Look, I'm standing with Hamid Karzai, who is not a popular figure either in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. So that was very clearly intended for the West.
Yeah. We talked earlier about the Bhutto dynasty, and you you described the Pakistan People's Party as, in your book, as a family heirloom, sort of passed on from generation to generation. Now the young, I guess, 19-year-old son of Benazir Bhutto is the life chairman of the party or something like that. Yeah. He seems like a Machiavellian figure now, Zardari. In your book, you basically blame him for the assassination of his son, really. I mean, not his son, his brother-in-law. Benazir Bhutto's brother, who, along with his other brother, formed a militant resistance movement. Could you talk a little bit about that? I think it's shocking to hear that the president of Pakistan could have been involved in the assassination of his brother-in-law.
That is what he was charged with. As I point out in the book, he was never tried for that. But the case against him was quite strong. I've seen all the documentation. Look, Bob, you have Murtaza Bhutto, who was slain in power, in his house, family house in Clifton. You have his sister in power as prime minister. The police decide to ambush Murtaza Bhutto as he is going home from a meeting outside his house. Senior police officers are on the scene. The ambush is carried out. This boy and some of the people with him are shot dead. He lies on the floor outside his house bleeding, and it takes ages before an ambulance even comes to pick him up. And this has not been authorized by someone high up. It's mind-boggling to think that it could be done. What is said in reply to these charges is that this was done yet again by the ISI to embarrass Benazir Bhutto when she was in power. Well, I don't believe that, to be honest. I've seen no evidence suggesting that. And there is evidence to suggest that, and you know, everyone knows that Murtaza Bhutto, Benazir's brother, and Zardari loathed each other. That's not a big secret. They'd clashed. Murtaza Bhutto had accused Zardari of destroying the Bhutto name, destroying the family, accused him of corruption. He used to denounce him in public. And Murtaza Bhutto was taken out. And senior police officials were involved in this whole business. And the commission of inquiry that was set up by Benazir Bhutto herself pointed the finger in the direction of Zardari in the official establishment. Mm-hmm. So he was never tried for it, so we can't say he's guilty. It's important to make that distinction, but certainly there are very few people who believe that he wasn't responsible.
And it's important also to say that these are not just conspiracy theories like who killed Jack Kennedy in 1963. This is actual factual material that suggests that the president of Pakistan was involved in a political assassination of someone in his own family. And on top of that, as you described in the book, literally billions of dollars are at stake in terms of corruption. There were legal cases all over the world against him and his wife to some degree, of course, his late wife. I think you say that up to $1.5 billion perhaps was looted from Pakistan by the family. So this is something that I guess most people who now see him being lauded as a potential savior of the country ought to understand, right? He's coming to New York, I guess today. He's going to meet with Sarah Palin, among other luminaries. That should be an interesting meeting. What accounts for the plaudits that this man is getting in the United States?
Well, that he's now decided he wants to be a poodle of Washington. He will do their bidding. And from Washington's point of view, it's quite convenient to have a creature like him because they have so much on him that, you know, which can be used.
Right.
So I think that is why. And, you know, the memory of people in this day and age, Bob, is so short that anyone can be laundered and made to look very clean if the global media networks in the United States wants them to. But I think it was one thing to do that with Benazir Bhutto, who did have, you know, there was still a well of affection for her in the country. I mean, I was very critical of her, but, you know, many other people weren't. But for this guy, whose last time there was a big serious opinion poll in the country, his ratings were even lower than Bush. He stood at 14%. People don't like him, they don't trust him, he's regarded as completely corrupt, and the fact that he's now a total poodle of the US will make him even less popular. So even from the point of view of the US interest, he's not a great figure to have running the country. It's a big tragedy for Pakistan, this, and his particular elevation to the presidency is, I think, probably a very, one of the more debased episodes in our country's history. You can't write off what has been done by these people, Some people say, oh, give him a chance, he'll turn a new leaf. I doubt it very much, because politics is not the dominant idea in his head, leave alone political principles. This is power for its own sake.
The core of your book really is a discussion of America's role in shaping and guiding and manipulating, sometimes overtly, sometimes from behind the scenes, Pakistani politics. You use a very funny term in your book. You say that in Pakistan, stooges were often called spoons, and sometimes Pakistani leaders have been confronted by crowds of people waving spoons at them to show that they have contempt for these kinds of leaders. You also somewhat humorously described Pakistan as the condom for the United States in its intervention into Afghanistan. But these kind of terms of ridicule resonate in Pakistan, don't they? In a country where you have so little access to health care, to education, even to clean drinking water, certainly to jobs and a livelihood of dignity. What effect does this have on the country inside when they see their leaders so overtly collaborating with the United States against what most people might think is Pakistan's own true national interest?
Well, it creates a great deal of anger. Pakistan has been blessed with its poets. There used to be one great poet, Habib Jalib, now dead, who, when President Ayub Khan in the 60s was coming on yet another state visit to Pakistan, wrote a two-line poem in which he said, President, just one request, just one plea. Don't go to America. It was rhymes in our language, achy. Anyway, I won't repeat it. And then the same poet, when Bhutto was in power, repeated that poem in public. When Zia was in power, he was locked up and used to sing it in prison. And this has been the refrain of our poets and satirists and critical journalists from the beginning of the country till now, Bob, and it's still going on. This is a country really gripped on the flight path of US power, and now this power is getting closer and closer. And the real needs of the people are very different. These needs are not being supplied by either the jihadis, who are not popular in Pakistan at all, or the military, or the political class, or the United States. And the problems are what you've just described and what I go into great detail in my book, that the real task is to modernize the country in the best sense of the word. When I was researching this book, I went into places and talked to people. And there was one family, poor family I spoke to, really poverty-stricken. And I said, if you had the choice, what would you like the most? And she said, for my children, all my children to be educated and for them to learn English. Now, this surprises people, but the language, English as a language, is spoken in Pakistan largely by the elite. And so people see this as yet another thing which they have no access to, because they see if you know English, you can go abroad, you can get another education, you can read books which are not available in your own language. And I often say to friends in Pakistan that Dr. Mahathir in Malaysia, another Muslim country, has succeeded partially in modernizing that country, and that for the last 30 years, English has been a compulsory second language for Chinese and Malays. If Mahathir can do it in Malaysia, why can't any Pakistani government do it in Pakistan? And it's tied into the fact that this is really an incredibly corrupt and callous elite. A friend was telling me the other day that there was a large, lavish wedding from within the elite in the city of Lahore, where there is widespread poverty. And the tents they had organized for the wedding were mimicking the court at Versailles in France in the 18th century, with lots of mirrors, etc. That food and wine flowed through the whole night. And outside the wedding, the drivers who brought these people, the chauffeurs, were sitting huddled up in the cold last winter, waiting for it. And there is now great, great anger on the basis of the class needs of the poor in Pakistan.
You know, needless to say, most of this is invisible to American policymakers. At least it's not something they think about. Someone very smart told me once that in Iraq we didn't invade the real Iraq, we invaded the Iraq of our dreams, and not the real Iraq, the one that we later found to be there. In Pakistan, we seem to deal with the Pakistan of our nightmares, the country that is the source of terrorism that strikes America, but we miss the real Pakistan. And that's what you're describing just now. What can the United States do to get a grasp of the real Pakistan and to understand the underlying problems that lead to the appeal even of some of these jihadis to ordinary Pakistanis who are pushed to the end of their rope?
All they need to do is to open their eyes, Bob. I mean, there's a large American presence in that region. There are lots of very intelligent US journalists who visit that country and see it. They should report what they see, and some of them do, to be fair. But by and large, American policymakers look at Pakistan essentially, the gaze, the US gaze, as far as Pakistan is concerned, is how do we use this country to serve our needs in the region, and now particularly in relation to the occupation of Afghanistan. And that has always been the gaze of the United States during the Cold War. How do we use this country as a pawn to marginalize India, which refuses to do our bidding? It's always been like that the country is seen in terms of US interests and not the interests of the majority of people in that country. And this is partially what has brought us round to this pass. You know, people say, yeah, we know what we did in the 80s against the Russians, and yeah, mistakes were made. But you know, for you, they are mistakes because you're now far removed from them. Though they didn't remain mistakes when the people who you'd worked with finally hit back in 9/11, former allies. So history has a way of never going away. It continues to echo, even if you want to forget it. And in Pakistan, these echoes are very strong because people know what was done to that country and what is being done now. That explains the unpopularity of the United States. I mean, the New America Foundation conducted an opinion poll some months ago, and I think over 60% said that they regarded the United States as the biggest threat to peace in the region. 11% said India, which I thought was, the 11% figure was a figure which filled me with hope, that people are not seeing India as the main enemy in perpetuity, that there is possibility of changes and shifts in that region.
Let's talk a little bit about that hope in the minutes that we have left here. You say something very important, which I myself have been trying to get across in this country and in my work, that the ultimate solution for Pakistan is a regional agreement that would involve Iran and India, possibly involving Russia and China to some degrees, and other countries that could create a security framework and a political framework that could help stabilize the country and to put it on the path of economic development as opposed to the American flight path that you say in your subtitle. Talk a little bit about what that might look like.
There are two related things. It's in relation to Afghanistan. When I say, that we need an exit strategy from Afghanistan for the West. And I said this exit strategy shouldn't be what was done in the past, is more or less to hand over the country to one contractor, let's say the Pakistani military. I think that would not be in the interest of Afghanistan. But I think in terms of withdrawing from Afghanistan, which should be seriously considered, you could have a regional situation with Pakistan, India, Iran, and Russia guaranteeing a government in Afghanistan for 10 years, peace, because they all have support in that country, and the inflow then of proper aid to rebuild the country after a 30-year war, which has been going on. As far as Pakistan itself is concerned, Bob, the phrase I use is that it needs to readjust its time. Pakistani time Pakistani clocks, speaking metaphorically, are adjusted to either Washington time or Saudi Arabian time. And they need to be readjusted to South Asian time. Pakistan is a major country, the sixth largest in the world, nearly 200 million people. India, of course, is the major country in that part of the world and globally. But we need a South Asian Union, is what I've been arguing for now 20 years, on the model of the European Union, where the sovereignty of the individual states is not challenged, but there's an opening of borders, there is trade between these two countries, and the years of war are ended. And there is demilitarization too. And I think this could be done, and within this framework, if you take Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, you could begin to solve the contentious issue, the Tamil question in Sri Lanka, the Kashmir question between India and Pakistan, by the union guaranteeing the autonomy of these regions. Not giving them independence, which many of them don't even want, but guaranteeing their autonomy. And I think that is the way we have to look if we want to end this century, for this region at least, on a high note.
Mm-hmm. And what's the current state of relations between Pakistan and India? Of course, they've fought several wars. They've been on the brink of war even recently in this decade. Both have nuclear weapons, but they seem to have as well a process of dialogue, and I think both countries probably understand the importance of reaching some sort of accord. Is anything like that on the horizon, or is it too far-fetched at this point?
Well, it is on the horizon, but there are no real concrete moves being made in its direction. And at the same time, even as we speak, the area of Kashmir occupied by India has witnessed the largest mass civil disobedience movement, non-violent, ever in its history, demanding an end to the Indian presence. So it's not that Pakistan is the only country under pressure on the northwest frontier. India is under pressure from within Kashmir of people who say they don't want to be ruled by India. They don't want the presence of Indian troops in the region. So in this situation, it is essential for both the leaders of both countries and other countries to come together and think of a unified solution, which doesn't mean losing any sovereignty, but it means actually creating the basis for something good, filling people with hope for once rather than despair.
Well, let's hope that the next president of the United States reads your book and is willing to give Pakistan and India and other countries in the region some breathing room to maybe work out their own solution. But I think we're going to have to end it here. It's been, for me at least, a fascinating and interesting discussion, and thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
If this were a dictatorship, it'd be a heck of a lot easier. Just so long as I'm the dictator.